For centuries, humanity saw itself as one of a kind, distinct, separate from every other creature that ever roamed the earth. We were taught that Neanderthals were an entirely different, uncivilized, and ultimately extinct species. Meanwhile, we Homo sapiens were thought to be the victors of a brutal evolutionary contest. But what if I told you that this narrative is far from complete? What if hidden within your DNA is the trace of an ancient encounter? Today, we're going to journey back in time, not just through reason, but through imagination as well. To a world where two types of humans coexisted, competed, and perhaps even shared something deeper. Did the Neanderthals vanish completely, or does a part of them still live on? Around 400,000 years ago, Neanderthals roamed the heart of Europe and Western Asia. They weren't our direct ancestors, but rather a closely related species, having diverged from our lineage over 500,000 years ago. While we, Homo sapiens, were still evolving in East Africa, the Neanderthals had already adapted to the harsh conditions of glacial landscapes, hunting mammoths with basic spears and looking after their elderly. Contrary to the clumsy image Hollywood painted, Neanderthals were not brutish creatures. Their brains were actually larger than ours, and their bodies more robust. They had mastered fire, buried their dead, and likely had a form of language. For thousands of years, they were the dominant humans of the European Paleolithic, until around 60,000 years ago, when things began to shift. From Africa, a new species of human emerged, Homo sapiens. They were slimmer, perhaps more resourceful, but also more vulnerable. Along with them came new ways of seeing the world, new methods of communication, and a fresh approach to art. In caves and temporary shelters, they etched symbols and handprints onto walls, adorned themselves with jewelry, seashell necklaces, and used red ochre to paint their bodies. While Neanderthals were practical, Homo sapiens were creative, or so we believed for a long time. The first encounter between these two species was likely a silent one. It could have taken place in what is now Israel, Syria, or Turkey. Imagine a group of Neanderthals, stocky and weathered from generations of surviving in cold climates, watching from a hill as taller, darker-skinned strangers, carrying lighter tools and communicating with unfamiliar gestures and sounds, approached. Was it a moment of friendship, tension, or curiosity? What's most astonishing is that we don't know for certain. There are no written accounts, no historical records, only bones, stones, and molecular remnants. But something was recently discovered that changes everything. We carry a part of them inside us. In 2010, the scientific community was stunned. A team led by Svante Pääbo successfully sequenced the entire Neanderthal genome, and the most astonishing revelation, when comparing it with the DNA of modern humans, they found that all non-African people share between 1% and 4% of their genetic makeup with Neanderthals. This could only mean one thing: there had been interbreeding. This discovery was monumental. It shattered the previous belief that Neanderthals were an inferior species, destined to be replaced by Homo sapiens. What was once thought to be a tale, a violent replacement, where one species eradicates the other, turned out to be a story of fusion. A more complex, more human narrative. But how did this happen? Were these encounters sporadic and accidental? Or did entire communities share space, culture, and even blood? The archaeological evidence offers only subtle hints. When we look into the mirror, we see a modern face, a body shaped for today's world. But what we don't see is the mark of the past, hidden deep within our genetic code, because DNA doesn't forget. Every cell we have holds stories written in molecular ink. And some of those stories aren't just from Homo sapiens, they're from Neanderthals. But what does it truly mean to carry 2% Neanderthal DNA? Are we talking about useless decorative genes? Far from it. In recent years, geneticists have discovered that the DNA fragments we inherited from Neanderthals are still active in our bodies, influencing vital aspects of our lives, from our immune system to our skin, hair, and even mental health. For example, certain Neanderthal genes help us fight viruses like the flu and HIV. Others affect the keratin in our skin, allowing Homo sapiens to adapt more quickly to colder climates when they migrated to Europe. Some Neanderthal variants have even been linked to increased risks of depression, nicotine addiction, or heightened sensitivity to pain. In 2020, a study found a specific Neanderthal DNA fragment linked to a higher vulnerability to severe COVID-19. The traces of those ancient encounters still impact us today. We are a living blend of both the past and the present. There's more. When scientists analyze the inherited genes, something curious stands out. Most of them come from Homo sapiens mothers and Neanderthal fathers. This suggests that the interactions between the two species weren't entirely equal. Why? Some researchers believe it might have been due to biological incompatibilities, making pregnancies between Neanderthal women and Homo sapiens men less likely to succeed. Others theorize that it could have been due to power imbalances or even instances of sexual violence during conflict. The genetic evidence is there, but it doesn't always explain the how. It doesn't tell us about emotions, intentions, or the precise circumstances of those encounters. It only shows us that they occurred, and that they resulted in offspring. Even more surprising findings have come from the Denisova cave in Siberia, where the DNA of a young woman who lived over 40,000 years ago was discovered. Her mother was Neanderthal, and her father was a Denisovan, another extinct human species. Yes, there were more than just two types of humans at that time. The Denisovans were close relatives of the Neanderthals, with distinct genetic traits, and they also interbred with Homo sapiens. This doesn't seem like an exception anymore. It seems like the norm. For tens of thousands of years, different human species lived side by side, shared territories, and intermingled. Humanity was diverse and complex, like a symphony of evolutionary branches that intertwined, collided, disappeared, and survived in others. Today, modern Homo sapiens are the only surviving human species. But for much of our history, we were not alone. Imagine this: 3 different types of humans coexisting on Earth. Neanderthals in Europe and Western Asia, strong and resilient. Denisovans in East Asia, adapted to extreme altitudes like Tibet. And Homo sapiens migrating out of Africa, learning and adapting as they moved. In this melting pot of human encounters, something new emerged: a mixed, imperfect, resilient humanity. Science no longer speaks of missing. Picture this: a quiet night around 45,000 years ago. Snow blankets the hills. A group of Neanderthals huddle around a fire, their stone tools neatly arranged, their hides shielding them from the cold. Nearby, hidden among the trees, a group of Homo sapiens watches them. They hesitate, unsure whether to approach or stay hidden. At some point, someone makes the first move. A gesture, an offering, perhaps a share of meat, or simply silence. This is how many encounters must have started. Not with war, but with a quiet acknowledgement. With wariness, fear, and perhaps hope. Under the same moon, 2 human species faced not only the harsh conditions of the Pleistocene climate, but also something far more complex: the possibility of coexisting. Archaeological evidence points to coexistence, not just conflict. In the Grotte Mandrin cave in France, remains of both Homo sapiens and Neanderthals have been found, suggesting they occupied the same site intermittently for thousands of years. Did they alternate, or did they coexist in the same space? Perhaps they shared the shelter at different times, or, at some points, even together. Their cultures began to blend as well. For many years, it was assumed that only Homo sapiens were capable of creating art, making symbolic decorations and engaging in abstract thinking. But now we know Neanderthals were also capable of these things. In the La Pasiega cave in Spain, cave paintings dating back more than 64,000 years have been discovered, created by Neanderthals. These are geometric shapes, lines, and dots, not figurative art like that of Altamira or Chauvet, but symbolic nonetheless. It represents meaning. Neanderthals also used pigments, decorated their bodies, and crafted necklaces from bird feathers and claws. The line between what was considered primitive and modern is becoming increasingly blurry. Moreover, some archaeologists have begun to speak of a cultural hybrid zone, a period of time and space where Homo sapiens and Neanderthals didn't just coexist physically but mentally as well. They learned from one another, inspired each other, or even collaborated on innovations. What if many of the ideas we attribute to Homo sapiens were, in part, Neanderthal ideas? What if our symbolic evolution was, in fact, a shared experience? Between 50,000 and 35,000 years ago, this period was a hotbed of innovation. More advanced tools, finely crafted tips, musical instruments, burial rituals, and art. But it was also a time of tension. The climate fluctuated wildly, competition for food was intense, and populations were small and fragile. An epidemic could wipe out an entire group. A drought could push one tribe to invade another's land. And yet, interbreeding continued. Though it was not widespread, it left a lasting genetic legacy. It wasn't a large-scale fusion, but a series of isolated encounters that occurred over thousands of years. This speaks to something deeper, the drive for connection, even when survival was the primary concern. The children born from these unions survived. They were accepted. They integrated. Perhaps they were seen as unique, a blend of worlds, or perhaps they were simply human. Today, scientists can trace vast regions of the human genome and observe how certain Neanderthal segments are more prevalent in some populations than others. For instance, East Asian populations tend to have a slightly higher percentage of Neanderthal DNA than European ones. This suggests multiple waves of interaction and a complexity that we're still trying to fully understand. But the impact wasn't just biological. It was symbolic too. Each encounter was a story, a shift. For years, archaeologists believed that Neanderthals vanished abruptly, as if they were completely wiped out by Homo sapiens in a total conquest. But the evidence doesn't support a sudden disappearance. What we now understand is that their decline was slower, more tragic, and ultimately more human. In the final 10,000 years of their existence, Neanderthals began to lose their demographic strength. Their population, which was already small, became even more fragmented. Isolated groups with little genetic diversity became common. As a result, they became increasingly prone to inbreeding, and their ability to adapt to changing environments diminished. Meanwhile, Homo sapiens were thriving. They grew in numbers, developed more advanced tools, and established broader social networks. They communicated more symbolically, and perhaps most importantly, possessed an extraordinary ability: the ability to cooperate in large groups, beyond just family ties. This organizational advantage may have been decisive. While Neanderthal groups typically consisted of only 10 to 20 individuals, Homo sapiens could form bands of 50, 100 or more. They could exchange resources, information, and mates with other tribes, often spread out over vast distances. They forged alliances and created shared myths, which, in a hostile world, gave them a significant evolutionary edge. However, this doesn't mean Neanderthals were inferior. They were not primitive animals. They had large brains, language, culture, and the capacity for affection. Evidence of Neanderthals who survived severe illnesses or injuries suggests they cared for their sick and wounded, showing compassion. One of the most poignant examples of this is the case of the Shanidar man, found in Iraq. This Neanderthal, who had lost an arm, was partially blind and had suffered injuries that left him disabled, managed to live for many years after the injuries. Someone cared for him, shared food with him, and offered shelter. And when he died, he was buried, an act that demonstrates care, respect, and perhaps even grief. Yes, Neanderthals buried their dead. Some burials included flowers, pigments, and other objects. This wasn't mere instinct, it was symbolic. It represented memory, mourning, and loss. It was humanity. So why did they disappear? Today, the most accepted explanation is that their extinction was caused by a combination of factors rather than a single event. Climate change played a significant role. Europe and Asia underwent extreme cycles of glaciation and warming, which drastically affected their habitats and the availability of food. Prey animals migrated, and vast forests turned into tundras. Winters became long and harsh. Additionally, Homo sapiens brought new diseases, pathogens to which the Neanderthals had no immunity. Much like the impact of European contact on the native peoples of the Americas, this exchange between species could have brought devastating pandemics. And of course, interbreeding contributed to the Neanderthal disappearance as well. They didn't vanish entirely. They were absorbed. They didn't face extinction. They gradually blended into the Homo sapiens gene pool. Picture it this way: the Neanderthal lineage didn't die out. It was diluted. It was absorbed like a drop of ink in the vast ocean of time. That drop is still traceable today. However, the physical disappearance of the Neanderthals remains an emotional enigma. What was that final group like? Did they know they were the last of their kind? Did they keep telling stories around the fire, unaware that there would be no more generations to come? Did they view Homo sapiens with suspicion, curiosity, or resignation? For a long time, saying you have a bit of Neanderthal in you was a way of insulting someone. It suggested clumsiness, rudeness, or primitiveness. But today, science has forced us to rethink that notion. Yes, we do carry some Neanderthal in us, literally, genetically. And it's not a flaw, it's an inheritance. In 2010, the world of science changed dramatically with the Neanderthal Genome Project led by Svante Pääbo. It revealed that people of non-African descent have between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. This meant that at some point, our ancestors didn't just live alongside Neanderthals, they fell in love, had children, and those children thrived. This discovery wasn't just a curious tidbit. It completely transformed how we understand the past. It showed that human evolution wasn't a straightforward progression, but rather a complex network of interactions, intersections, and crossbreeds. It was a tree with roots that intertwined, rather than a linear path forward. What's even more fascinating is that those Neanderthal genes continue to impact us today. We now know that Neanderthal DNA plays a role in our skin and hair color, our immune systems, and how we respond to viruses or stress. Some studies suggest that these ancient genes might even be linked to modern health issues, like type 2 diabetes or depression. In other words, the events of 40,000 years ago still affect our daily lives. One of the most interesting revelations is that some Neanderthal genes are connected to our sense of smell, meaning some modern humans may have a sharper sense of scent because of that ancient genetic legacy. Other Neanderthal fragments could influence skull shape, height, or even our daily rhythms, whether we tend to be more active at night or during the day. But it's not just about physical traits. There are more subtle effects too. Some researchers are exploring the connection between Neanderthal DNA and neurological traits. Could these genes influence how we experience fear, pain, or even loneliness? While we don't yet have all the answers, each new discovery reinforces a central idea. We are not alone in our human journey. We are the result of many different human species, and we're not just talking about Neanderthals. In Asia, Homo sapiens also interbred with the Denisovans, another human species that was identified relatively recently through a tiny bone fragment, found in the Denisova cave in Siberia. Populations in Oceania, including Aboriginal Australians and Melanesians, carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. This suggests that interbreeding between human species was much more common than we once thought. It wasn't an accident. It was a strategy for survival, a way to enhance the gene pool and better adapt to harsh climates and challenging environments. And perhaps it was a way to connect. Because here's the most powerful idea. In a world without national boundaries, religions, or ideologies, two human species met, observed each other, and chose to come together, not as enemies, not as predators, but as potential companions. Today, when we talk about us versus them, when we draw lines between cultures, people, or skin tones, we forget that we are all descendants of a vast, intertwined family. We are hybrids, not pure. The myth of human purity is just that, a myth, one based on ignorance. Genetics has proven what empathy has always hinted at. We are part of an ancient, widespread, and complex family. A family that survived ice ages, hunger, and isolation, thanks to its ability to mix, to evolve, and to adapt. Perhaps in that distant moment of the Pleistocene, Neanderthals weren't monsters or mere legends. They were human. Distinct, yes, but undeniably human. They lived, loved, cared, and dreamed. And although their bodies faded away thousands of years ago, a part of them still lives on within us. Their essence flows through our blood, in our resilience to the cold and in the movements we make, some of which we don't fully comprehend. They linger in the questions we ask when gathered around the fire, and in the bittersweet nostalgia we feel for experiences we never had. In today's world, it's vital to remember that our story isn't one of conquest, but rather connection. We're not the final step of an evolutionary journey. We're the bridge between many different paths. So when you look into the mirror next, don't just see Homo sapiens. You might also be seeing a face that once roamed with mammoths, someone who